Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I've been in South Jersey my whole life, born and raised. I live about 20 minutes from Galloway, the Pine Barrens. Also 20 minutes from Leeds Point, aka the birthplace of the Jersey Devil. I live just about 20 minutes from the trail that leads to the old Leeds house, birthplace of the Jersey Devil. My backyard is all woods. Not the Pine Barrens, but I do live in a wooded area. I've seen and heard plenty of creepy things in my 29 years of living here. Encountered a few cryptids, not face to face. My Ring doorbell at the time caught something on camera. One time it did in fact look like the Jersey Devil, the other time it looked like a crawler crawling out from under my pool deck. I've heard unnatural sounds come from the woods. Like a sound that a human or animal can't make. Or a sound that doesn't belong. Like a pig squealing. Trust me, no wild pigs here in South Jersey unless they're on a farm, and I don't live near a farm. My dad has heard screeching coming from the woods while out in the middle of the night tending to the pool. Now my dad is a no-nonsense, retired Army veteran who doesn't believe in the paranormal. This past summer that all changed when he heard something ungodly in the woods. Plus he saw what I caught on the ring, so he is not a believer that something is out there. I've found hoof prints in the snow, not regular deer hoof prints. Hoof prints that were walking as if the deer were bipedal and with a huge stride. Like a couple feet apart. I'd follow them and they'd just disappear into the woods or as if it just flew away. When I was a teenager, at one of our family parties, my cousins and I were in the pool and we all saw red eyes watching us from the woods. My one cousin and I were in the jacuzzi, different time, and again saw the red eyes. Never ran so fast into my house in my life. Anyway, I could go on. I've had plenty of experiences. The plus side to all this is that whatever it is out there doesn't seem to bother us. I do believe in the Jersey Devil and all things paranormal. I believe I've encountered him a few times, seen his hoof prints, and maybe even caught him on my ring. I always say I don't really mind if he's out there. Because if he really is and that's what I've seen, he doesn't ever bother us or me. That goes for anything that may be out there that isn't an animal. Sure, we hear things and catch glimpses of things or see eyes watching us, but it never escalates further, knock on wood.
So, this took place in the summer of 2017. I was driving in southern New Jersey, in Cumberland County. I was out with my girlfriend at the time and we always went on explorations and adventures together. In typical New Jersey fashion, we just drove around aimlessly near the Pine Barrens, which is a large area of pine forest that takes up a lot of South Jersey. We would always joke about trying to find the Jersey Devil, which was a mythological creature of New Jersey folklore. Basically, you just drove around pointing out shadows and trying to scare your girlfriend. Anyway, as we were driving along at probably 2 a.m., we had a large section of forest surrounding us on a lonely road. We were the only car for miles, but there were a few houses here and there. As we drove, I remember seeing movement to the right of the vehicle. From the front, illuminated by the headlights, but to the right of the car. As I drove by, there was a creature standing at about 4 or 5 feet in height. It seemed to be covered in brown hair, almost like a goat's. It had black wings that appeared to be leathery or smooth. I did not see a head, face, or anything else distinguishable. As we approached, maybe a distance of 10 to 20 yards, the creature flapped its wings a few times and took off vertically. Not at an angle like a plane of birds take off. It then disappeared as we drove past. The whole incident took maybe 5 or 7 seconds. I almost discounted it as a hallucination induced by lack of sleep or something, but my girlfriend interrupted my thought process by saying, "Did you see that?" Without hesitation, we pulled over and bailed out of the car with a flashlight. There was nothing. We looked and listened for a few minutes but couldn't find anything. We then started to Google all the wildlife of New Jersey to see if we could find what we saw. No animal appeared close to what we observed. I don't know what we saw that evening. I will make no assumptions. I just saw a creature I could not identify in the short time that it was observed. Now, I'm a lawman in South Jersey and have seen some strange and crazy things in my time on the streets. But this is definitely the creepiest. I have never seen anything like that since, but lots of other people in New Jersey have reported similar sightings.
This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I am 21 now and it has never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best way. My grandfather John was a man who was extremely calloused and old-fashioned. He was bitter and a complete macho man. My mother was raised never showing emotion or pain due to his lack of compassion for others. He had many secrets that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very no-nonsense type of man. He also was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mom was born in 1965 and remembers this story clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. This was an area located within the New Jersey Pine Barrens. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother, my grandmother, were all there and very excited about this. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt backwoods road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of this since they are all used to the woods, and these woods, in particular, were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff they brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be any animal in these woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. Scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued playing while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous, sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it, at least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bum-bum-bum pattern, 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was getting not just louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go," he yelled. "Get in the car." He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at this moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and as quickly as possible threw it all into the car. They had no care for the things they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk, and items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main grunt of the story ends. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself I would ask him one day. Now I can't and regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. This story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and my family all drifted apart. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood. Nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am one of the only people in the family who is still curious about what happened. I have always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story piqued my interest more than any others in my family. I wish I had answers.
I want to be as detailed as possible. I live about 15 to 20 minutes from the infamous Leeds Point, birthplace of the Jersey Devil. Growing up, we were often out in the pines paintballing, riding dirt bikes, exploring old abandoned houses, and mudding. We grew up with the Jersey Devil lore very present in our life. My sister was 12 years older than me, and her husband took us out to Leeds Point. We would find old rundown houses and say that it was the old Leeds house to spook us and things like that. We never took it for more than a local legend. As we got older, we became more fascinated and even tracked down the original house through the locals. The house is just an old crumbling foundation at this point. My buddies and I hadn't been camping or riding in a while, so we decided we would do a 2-day ride and all-day camp out and party all night for the weekend. I had just finished restoring a dirt bike that I had found in my brother's basement. I was super stoked to shred it as it was my first and to this day only build. We drove out there and found a clearing that was quite odd. I heard about strange phenomena involving cleared circles that don't grow plants. Wasn't until a couple of years ago that I heard about them being referred to as the Devil's Tramping Ground, where demons would frequent. Seemed like an ideal spot to set up camp, as I was none the wiser at the time. We set up and rode all day and partied all night. Nothing strange occurred that first night. We woke up in the morning and it was overcast. The whole vibe of the day was off. They were calling for rain at night, but we were determined to get this last summer camping trip off, so we decided to stay. There was a large patch of gravel at one end of the camp. It was getting tamped down as we were constantly in and out of the camp for drinks and gas over the 2 days. It will be relevant later. The second night, we all went to bed around 12 to 12:30 a.m. Around 3 a.m. I woke up and had to relieve myself badly, so I got out of my tent and went over to the edge of the camp opposite of the gravel patch. As I did my business, everything got quiet. Mind you, this is summertime in New Jersey. The crickets, toads, and even birds around that time are usually singing away. I thought it odd, but figured maybe I spooked them stumbling through the darkness. I started to get this uneasy feeling of dread, like someone was watching me, and started to hear what sounded like hooves clopping on that gravel patch. It was so dark, but the moon was bright, so I could make out silhouettes, and I saw something on the other end of the camp by the gravel entrance. I thought a deer wandered into our camp, but thought that unlikely because Jersey deer are scared to death of humans. I think it realized I noticed it, and it shifted its head to the side almost with a puzzled look. When it did, the moonlight hit its eyes, revealing them to be glowing red and beady. My self-preservation instincts kicked in, and I inched my way over to my tent, thinking if I moved slow enough it wouldn't be able to tell I was moving, until I stepped on a beer can. The crushing sound startled whatever was standing there. I heard the clap of hooves and what to me sounded like an enormous bird take off. I sat up the rest of the night petrified. It began to rain around 5 a.m. I went over to look for tracks, but by sunlight, the area was washed out. Never told my friends. They wouldn't have believed me.
I currently live in central Illinois, but I was born and raised in New Jersey, the Pine Barrens. Growing up there, we had all heard stories of encounters with the Jersey Devil. My grandma had an encounter along with my dad. Pretty much anyone who has ever lived there knows someone who has claimed to have seen this creature. Now I even have a former boss who staged a prank on his friend that ended up getting reported as a Jersey Devil sighting back in the 70s. He never told his friend it was all a prank, so I think that is still an official sighting in the books. Even after hearing all these stories growing up, I was never afraid to come across him. He was always portrayed as a shy, somewhat benign creature. He was never aggressive, and he was always visible enough for the person to just catch a glimpse of him. I'd always felt sorry for him in a way. He always seemed to lead such a lonely existence. Anyhow, I spent my childhood years riding around on my four-wheeler in his territory with no more fear of coming across the Jersey Devil than I would coming across a poorly concealed corpse dumped by the mob. Flash forward to my teen years, I'm working on a blueberry farm in Horton State Forest with my brother's girlfriend Janice. She didn't have a driver's license at the time, so I usually ended up driving her back and forth to work every day. We usually worked well past dinner time, and this particular story took place in the early days of fall. That evening, as I was dropping her off at her house, it was a few hours after sunset. The farm we worked on was pretty deep in the middle of nowhere, and the farm she lived on was even deeper in the middle of nowhere. To get to her house, we had to drive through some pretty thick forest on gravel roads with no streetlights. It would freak anyone out, I suppose, but I was used to driving through the dark woods, so it was never anything that really bothered me. I got Janice safely to her house, went inside and exchanged some pleasantries with her parents, and then shortly made my way home. I was on the last stretch of road before the main highway that would take me to the end of town. That's when I was overcome with the creepiest feeling. I can't describe it any other way than it just felt like I was being watched. So, like the dum-dum I am, I stopped the car. My doors were locked and I had a big wrench under my seat. I knew how to swing it to make it hurt if I needed to. I'm still in Jersey after all. So I'm sitting there scanning the road ahead of me, and I can't really see anything other than the 30 to 40-year-old blueberry bushes on either side of the road. If you let blueberry bushes grow wild, they'll climb to a pretty astonishing height. With these tall bushes lining the road, I really couldn't see too far into the forest around me. After looking for a few seconds, I popped back into the car and popped it back into gear. I slowly started pulling down the road again. That's when I noticed movement at the top of one of these tall bushes. I stopped the car again and immediately started staring in that direction. Once I focused my eyes, I could clearly see something very large crouching on the top of the one blueberry bush. I couldn't make out any details as far as colors or facial and body details, but it was something clearly silhouetted against the bright starry sky. What I could make out was something larger than a man with a huge head, sitting in a half-crouch position almost like it was ready to spring from its hind legs. I sat and stared at it for what seemed like an eternity. I was baffled how something that big could sit on top of a blueberry bush like that. As I said before, these bushes were old and tall but not very sturdy. They grow almost like a garden hedge, so anything couldn't possibly be sitting on top of them without breaking the branches and tearing the bushes all to heck. In my concentration at staring at whatever was in the bushes, I accidentally let my foot slip from the clutch and my car stalled the engine. Such a stupid move. This is the wrong move. Right there, in any horror movie, you don't let your car die in the middle of the woods while some creature is stalking you. Anyway, I think the sound of my car startled it because this thing's head whipped around to stare right at me, just as it took off in one swift motion, and was gone from my sight. As it was taking off, I didn't exactly see any wings on its back, but I heard a loud whooshing noise like large wings would make. In addition to hearing this, I could make out some very powerful-looking legs that were bent at the knees like a horse's legs would be. It used them and the assumed wings on its back to disappear from my sight in a second. Since the car was now stalled and quiet, I could hear a loud screech and whoosh of air above me that grew fainter within seconds. Whatever this thing was, it was fast and it was powerful. I know I weirdly kept talking about these blueberry bushes, but I swear they are important to the story. As this creature was taking off from me, those bushes almost bent in half as it jumped off of them, and I sat there watching them thrash and sway for quite a few moments after the creature was gone. Whatever was up there was skilled enough to sit on there without breaking the branches, but powerful enough to get them crashing around like crazy once it leaped off of them. Needless to say, I freaked the hell out, got the car started, threw it back into gear, and swung around the road heading back to the safety of Janice's house, all within moments of this thing screeching away from me. I must have looked like a crazy person. When I showed back up at their house, I drove over the railway ties in their driveway, left my driver's side door open, and I just barged into these people's house. I started babbling to Janice's dad about what I'd just seen, and he calmly told me I must have just seen the Jersey Devil. He drove with me back to the spot where I'd seen it, and it confirmed there was definitely a disturbance in the bushes on that side of the road. He told me that he'd had quite a few sightings of the Jersey Devil on his land before, but he had never said anything to his wife or daughters so they wouldn't get freaked out. Needless to say, I let the cat out of the bag on it, but he really didn't seem to mind. I think he was happy to have someone else bolster his own sightings on the land. I've never officially reported this sighting to date, but it did earn me a bit of a badge of courage among the locals for being dumb enough to stop and stare at a creature in the dark woods all by myself.
About 10 years ago, I was driving the Pennsylvania Turnpike coming home from a funeral in Ohio. I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. It was late, probably 11:30 or 1200, and I saw something hanging off of an overpass. At first I thought it was just a box or something that got stuck, but then it opened up. What I thought was a box was actually a pair of wings. Inside these wings was the craziest thing I've ever seen. It looked like a deer's or maybe a large greyhound's body, but the face was so long and wide, almost like a horse got stung by a boatload of bees. But the thing that stood out most and sends a shiver down my spine even now, were the eyes. At first I couldn't see the eyes, but when my headlights hit it, the eye shine was fire engine red. I saw all this in just about 20 seconds as I approached the overpass. As soon as my brain registered what I was seeing, I floored it. I was in a 1997 V8 Thunderbird, so the pickup left nothing to be desired. I was scared. I hit 100+ miles per hour before the car started shaking and I slowed down a bit. I watched my rear view to see if this thing was chasing me, but either it couldn't keep up or it didn't bother chasing me. A few weeks later I saw the Monster Quest episode on the Jersey Devil, and I started having flashbacks when they showed the sculpture of what had been described to the artist. It was pretty damn close. I still refuse to drive the Pennsylvania Turnpike at night, and we travel that stretch every year. I'll stay an extra day and face traffic just to avoid night driving on that road.
I lived in Galloway Township, New Jersey. I know about the Jersey Devil, Pine Barrens, and that sort of stuff. I'm also not really a believer, but I'm not a total skeptic either. I'm sure it's possible for monsters and ghosts to exist, but without having much experience, I don't know. Anyway, one night in 2015, I was home alone. I was 16 years old and my parents worked pretty late, and didn't get home until 3 or 4 a.m. I was used to it, no siblings, just a dog and 5 cats, so I had the house to myself. I'm laying on the couch watching TV and I notice something out of the corner of my eye, another pair of eyes looking at me through the sliding door glass. At first, I just assumed it was an animal or something. We get possums a lot at night, so I didn't think much about it. 5 minutes go by and I hear this weird clawing at the door. My living room was fairly large, and the TV was in front of me. Then, a couple feet away is the dining room table, and another sliding glass door that leads to my back porch and yard. The thing was on the porch. I got up to investigate, first by flicking the light switch on, and immediately it scrambled off the porch. It seemed to be scared of light, so I turned it off and grabbed a flashlight. It wasn't there, so I continued to assume an animal and went back to the couch. An hour goes by, and I hear this loud shriek coming from the yard. This time, getting scared, I jumped up and ran with the flashlight. I dimmed it down by taking my index finger and middle finger and kind of coiled it along the light, still making it visible, but not as bright. I shone it around the yard, and the thing was still there, but this time it was eating something. It looked to be small, like a rabbit. Where I live, there's a ton of coyotes, so maybe one had strayed. But again, that shriek was awful, and not something I've ever heard come from a coyote's mouth. This thing was human, or close to it, anyway. The skin was black and kind of wrinkled, it had long limbs and seemed to be in a crouched position most of the time, but it was extremely fast. I got scared and shone the light at it directly, and it again screamed and dashed off into the woods. I stayed up until my parents came home. I didn't tell them yet, just in case it was something silly. I went to bed, and for the rest of the night, nothing about it came up. Any idea of what this thing is? Any help or advice is greatly appreciated. I'm an animal lover, So I don't want my cats or my dog outside one day and then getting devoured by God knows what's out there.
On November 28th of 2014, my life sort of fell apart all at once. In a matter of one day I lost my job, my business, my company car and my place to live for reasons that I won't go into detail about here. Let's just say that I was screwed over by my business partner, and that's that. At the time I had just enough money to either buy a junker vehicle or put down a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment. I'm a rather resourceful guy and I opted for the vehicle. I figured a car was a better move as I could live in it for as long as it took to get my life together, and it would give me more options for finding a new job. I had lost everything, but I had two things: a full set of camping gear and a girlfriend who still loved me, so I figured I could rough it outside in the cold winter nights until I found a new car and a job. At the time I had been living in a town that was located on the edge of the Pine Barrens wilderness of southern New Jersey. For those who have never heard of it, the Pine Barrens is a rather unique 1 million acre forest of mostly pine trees that has lots of deer, turkey, coyotes and some unique prehistoric type plants that only grow in that area. My girlfriend at the time lived with her parents, and despite the fact that they barely knew me, she had convinced them to take me in. But I was uncomfortable with that idea and refused the offer. As you can imagine, my girlfriend was beside herself with worry, but she knew I was too proud and just accepted my crazy decision to live outdoors in the winter time. I chose a spot on the edge of the neighborhood that I had been previously living in, near a dirt storage clearing that was being used to dump and store dirt to build a new development of homes. I found a large path into the woods and made a stealth camp only about a quarter-mile deep into the Pine Barrens. I would sleep in the woods at night, and in the morning I would make the short walk into civilization where my woman would pick me up. Once she came to get me, I would use her car to drive her to work and then spend the day looking for a vehicle and a new job. I would also take an hour or so to head to the gym to work out and get a shower each day. Around 5 p.m. I would pick her up at work and she would drop me back off near my campsite. Wednesday, December 3rd was to be my fifth and final night in that particular patch of woods. By then I had found a job that I was to start in a few weeks and had purchased an old SUV. It was still at the used car lot, as my new car insurance would not be active until the following day. My new job didn't start for a month, but I had already paid for a real campsite far away in another area of the Pine Barrens that I could live in until then. This way I could have big fires, ride my mountain bike through the trails, and not have to sneak in and out each morning and evening. So December 3rd, 2014 was my last night at my stealth camp on the edge of town. To this day I enjoy winter camping, and even then I had done so many times in my life, so I had a routine setup. I used to camp in cold weather. I always encapsulate my tent with a large, heavy-duty camo tarp. This keeps the weather out very effectively. It also helps to trap a little heat for comfort, but unfortunately makes it so that you cannot see outside without lifting the tarp up at your tent entrance to look around. By 8 p.m. or so I had finished eating and was relaxing, just puffing on my vape and feeling happy that I would be in a much more comfortable situation the next day. Just like every other night at this location at this time of night, a pack of coyotes was right outside my tent making a ruckus. The first 2 nights I was sort of shocked, but I was used to them and was sure they didn't dare attack a full-grown human. But I still slept with a 26-inch, very sharp, full-tang short sword at my side each night just in case. I was lying on my back in the tent starting to doze off to the sound of the coyote pack when they all started yipping and suddenly ran off into the deep woods together. During the previous nights they would slowly leave the area as a group, continuing to scrap and circle the general area, so this sudden departure sort of piqued my interest and I opened my eyes to listen. It was dead silent. After a minute or so I started getting ready to doze off again when a powerful and unpleasant stench filled my tent. I can't begin to explain how overwhelming and terrible the stench was. I sat up in my tent and stuck my face inside my coat to escape it. It was no use. There was no escaping the smell. It was a combination of extremely bad body odor mixed with skunk and feces. I was too overwhelmed by the odor to even ponder what was making it. It was strong enough to make me feel sick. I remember at one point trying to avoid the smell by breathing through my mouth, and the odor was so strong that I could taste it on the tip of my tongue. I was at the point of holding my breath, and whatever it was that was stinking up my campsite needed to go the hell away, so I decided to go outside my tent and run whatever it was off. I unsheathed my sword and started to unzip the tent entrance when I heard someone walking down the path in the woods that was located behind my camp. I say someone instead of something because it was clearly a person walking on 2 feet. I slowly zipped the tent back up and went silent. The path was pretty well traveled during the day by locals walking their dogs and by neighborhood kids, but this was the first time at night that I had heard anyone using the path. Whoever it was big and heavy because I could actually hear the thud of their feet impacting the dirt path with each step. I had made my stealth camp pretty close to the path for ease of use, but I had camouflaged it so well behind an earth mound with brush and a camo tarp that one could walk within a few yards of it and not see it. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of whoever it was leaving the dirt path and slowly walking into the woods behind me to my left. My heart sank and adrenaline filled my bloodstream. I had made it for 4 nights undetected, and on my last night I was about to be found out. I'm sure I was on some kind of private property, and with all the crap going on in my life at the time, the last thing I needed was for the cops to arrest me and break up my camp. Like I said, my camp was well hidden and it showed no signs of anyone being there while I was gone, so I was wondering why this person was heading towards me. This whole time the stench was just as strong as ever, but had taken backstage in my mind to the current new situation at hand. I could hear whoever it was carefully and slowly walking closer and closer until they were maybe 20 feet off to my left. They sounded like the footsteps of someone trying to sneak up on something or someone else. They stopped at my left side for a moment and then started to walk at a normal noisy pace through the leaves until they were about 15 or 20 yards from my tent in the area where the coyotes would congregate each night. Then they stopped. I could hear a deep hoarse breathing, like a giant monster catching its breath. I was paralyzed with fear and my heart was pounding out of my chest. Then it walked right up to the front of my tent. I clutched my blade and held my breath. Next, whatever it was, walked very slowly around to the right side of my tent. Still breathing deep and heavy. Then it leaned itself right up to the wall of my tent and started to sniff loudly. It took long deep sniffing noises through its nose and would exhale through its mouth. I was terrified as its face was just feet away from me. At this point I was growing confused. The only logical thing I could think of was that a bear was right outside of my tent. But the thing is that bears are almost non-existent in the Pine Barrens, especially so close to a busy construction site. But I thought to myself, what else could it be? Nothing was making sense. I was sure that I had heard a person on 2 feet walking this whole time. But no human, no matter how dirty and homeless, could smell that powerfully. Plus, the breathing I was hearing sounded more like a giant monster than a human. But monsters aren't real, right? So I rationalized that it had to be a bear. At this point I had to do something. I figured I would say something out loud. If it was a giant smelly person I could probably get a response, and if it was indeed a bear there was a 99.99% chance it would run for its life once it realized there was a human in the tent. One thing I knew was that black bears are terrified of humans. So I took a deep breath and said loudly and sharply, "Who's there?" And then I whacked the side of the tent it was standing at with a hard and quick backhand. The thing took 2 steps back, and to my absolute horror it let out the deepest, most terrifying growl I have ever heard. At this point, my heart stopped and I almost soiled my pants. It was a long and very deep growl, just like a dog, but sounded like a dog that would have to weigh 800 pounds. I sat there with my blade poised, in shock, terrified, and waited for whatever it was to rip through the tarp and kill me on the spot. After what was probably a 5 to 10 second growl. Then it went silent and all I could hear was the deafening noise of my pulse pounding in my head. Then suddenly to my surprise it walked away into the forest. I could hear the sound of a creature on 2 legs crushing the dried leaves and twigs underfoot as it walked away. I stayed perfectly still holding my breath until I could not hear it walking anymore. Then I took a deep breath and almost collapsed with relief in the tent. The horrible stench began to get less and less until it finally went away. I was feeling relieved and my heart was starting to finally calm down, when suddenly I heard the sound of what could only be a large tree branch being snapped quickly from a tree, or snapped in half, followed by it being smashed into a tree or other piece of wood. Right after that, it made a noise that sounded like a single very loud dog bark, followed what I can only describe as the sound of a woman screaming. My heart jumped to full turbo mode once again and I broke out into a cold sweat. After that, I heard nothing else, and it took a good 20 minutes for me to calm down. When the adrenaline finally subsided, I was overwhelmed with exhaustion. I reasoned that if it wanted to do me harm it would have, and at this point it was safe to fall asleep. Interestingly, I had one of the best night's sleep I have ever had. In the morning, I packed everything up and got out of there. When my girlfriend picked me up that morning, she took one look at me and asked me why I looked so disturbed. I told her what had happened and she said it must have been one of the coyotes and that I was being dramatic. To this day, the only people who believe me are my brother and my 13-year-old son. I had always told myself it was a bear. I couldn't come up with any other logical conclusion. But like I said, black bears are all but non-existent in the Pine Barrens. Also, since then I have done the research and have learned that bears do not have a strong odor at all, even during mating season or while hibernating. The thought of it being a Sasquatch never even crossed my mind at the time, because I thought they only existed in the northwestern United States and Canada, that is if they existed at all. Besides, what would a mythical creature like that be doing hanging out next to a fairly populated New Jersey town like that? Since then I have educated myself on Bigfoot and now I am pretty sure it was a Sasquatch that scared the crap out of me that night. I suppose I will never really know. My life is now perfect and it's hard to believe that just over 5 years ago I was homeless in the woods of New Jersey. I still like to go winter camping alone almost every year. But, now that I know monsters are real, I will only go to wilderness areas where I am allowed to carry a big bore revolver, 30.06 rifle or a 12 gauge with slugs.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.